Good afternoon. Welcome back to the last panel for this wonderful conference. My name is Suzanne Stewart-Steinberg. I'm director of the Pembroke Center, and I have the great honor to introduce, this is not really working, Juliet Hooker, to my left, who's professor of political science at Brown University. She's a political theorist specializing in racial justice, multiculturalism, Latin American political thought, and Black political thought. She's the author of Race and Politics of Solidarity and Theorizing Race in the Americas, and this last book won a number of awards. She's currently working on a book tentatively titled Black Grief, White Grievance, which explores the role of grief and grievance in contemporary racial politics in the United States. And the title of her talk is Grief and Black Politics. And then to my right is David McIvor, who is assistant professor of political science at Colorado State University. His primary research interests are in contemporary political theory and democratic theory, with a particular focus on critical theory and psychoanalysis. His book, published by Cornell University Press, is entitled Mourning in America, Race and the Politics of Loss. And David will speak first. You have 20 minutes.
Starting now or when I get there?
I'll let you travel, okay.
Every second counts. And I assume that thanking doesn't take up any of my time, because I do want to be the last of 15 to thank Juliet, unless she thanks herself, which she should do, for all the great work that she and Melvin did in putting this together, and Michelle Rose as well for all the logistics, which I know are intense and were intense. And it's just been, I've been really honored to be here and to think with everybody over the last day and a half. My head is kind of spinning and my ears are ringing. And then you know it's a good conference when like the thing you really want to do is to get back to work, right? And after a few glasses of wine, that's exactly what I'm going to do. So, okay, so the title of my paper on your thing says Mourning, Pessimism, and Narcissism. I didn't get to narcissism. I'm still hung up on pessimism, so that's what I'm going to leave you with today. But this conference asks us to examine the ways in which the archive of Black political thought can help political theorists to rethink key theoretical concepts in the disciplinary repertoire. And this panel in particular asks us to approach the intertwined questions of loss and mourning. At the outset, however, we should acknowledge that this is fraught terrain, full of problematic blank spaces. Black political thought and praxis has had, due to the violent positioning of Black bodies under white supremacy, to continually confront the questions of loss and the means, the meaning, and the possibility of mourning. Yet historically, political theory, with some exceptions, including work by many people in this room and another person on this panel, has too often ignored this tradition, which has impoverished its conceptual vocabulary and truncated its political imaginaries. So I have attempted in some recent work to humbly address some of these failures by reconceptualizing the work of mourning in the context of an aspirational account of democracy that is attuned to the living legacies of racial violence, segregation, stigma, and prejudice. And so here I'm going to recapitulate some of the basic claims that I make in my book, Mourning in America, which builds on psychoanalytic approaches to the topic of mourning. However, inspired by the charge of this conference, I will then show how my own account of mourning, potentially at least, is ensnared in an ontology of anti-Blackness. Through an engagement with the arguments of Afro-pessimism, I try to wrestle with this possibility, and in doing so, I will argue that what I refer to in my book as the democratic work of mourning has to find ways to account for the structural positioning of particular bodies before or as it accounts for the generative possibilities of mourning for democracy. But first, let me talk about some reasons why mourning might seem like a problematic concept for political theory, at least insofar as it is tied to psychoanalysis, by starting with Freud's 1917 essay, Mourning and Melancholia. And in that essay, Freud famously draws this distinction between mourning, understood as a healthy and normal response to loss, and melancholia, which is coded as pathological. And Freud describes mourning largely in economic terms in this essay. He says our libidinal investments in the other experience diminishing returns upon their death, and as a result, we gradually withdraw libido in order that it might be redirected to new objects. So mourning on this account is about moving past loss, right? On the other hand, melancholia occurs when there's a boundary confusion between the ego and the lost object. So the loss isn't clear or cannot be clarified, and hence, as Freud puts it memorably, the shadow of the object falls upon the ego. Now, Freud's admittedly speculative distinction between mourning and melancholia poses innumerable problems for political theorists who want to think about the politics of mourning in the context of racial violence. And here let me focus on two. First, this distinction describes how loss that cannot be clarified or that cannot be patiently or privately worked on or through inherently leads to melancholia. Secondly, the distinction between mourning and melancholia carries a normative weight that characterizes melancholia as unhealthy and unproductive. So those whose losses are illegible cannot mourn, and those who cannot mourn are continuously confronted with death, yet made culpable for this confrontation. So in this, I think of Claudia Rankine's book, Citizen, where she says, to live through the days, sometimes you moan like deer, sometimes you sigh. The world says, stop that. Another sigh, another stop that. Moaning elicits laughter, sighing upsets. And this relates to what Anne Cheng and others have called this sort of racial melancholia, right? That from within the terms of Freud's distinction, mourning over race is impossible. It is impossible because racialization, on Cheng's depiction, is a wholly melancholic activity. For both racial minorities and majorities, identities are constituted through both denying and incorporating the racial other. By this operation, the racial other is rejected and retained, with stigma persisting at the level of conscious and unconscious fantasy. Identities constructed in this melancholic fashion cannot mourn because race is not something they can get over or get past. Race and racially imbued fantasies of superiority or inferiority comprise the unconscious edifice upon which conscious life rests, and we cannot jump over our own shadows to clarify these losses or work through them. So there's a double injury here, right? Black grief is excluded from the work of mourning and in the process identified with pathology. Racial grief cannot be heard, and thereby any attempt to raise its voice is quickly and violently rejected. Rankine's Stop That, NFL protests, many, many examples. Race is melancholic, and melancholia is a psychosocial phenomenon with deadly effects. Now, on this reading, the rhetoric or practices of public mourning, which I'm calling for in my book, are potentially complicit in the process of injury for which they supposedly offer a means of repair. Mourning for racial minorities remains inaccessible because the losses themselves cannot appear. When injunctions to mourn appear, then, they can take the form of a second killing of the lost object because they insist on getting past what remains an open wound. Mourning in this context is perhaps only a means of reinforcing existing dynamics of power and powerlessness, calling on the relatively powerless to forgive and forget, to move on or get past that which has not even been remembered, right? But is there a way to think differently about mourning in the context of race in our racialized past and present? And I think there is, and in order to sketch out what this might look like, I turn from Freud towards post-Freudian psychoanalysis, and specifically the work of Melanie Klein. And in my book, Mourning in America, I use Kleinian concepts to articulate a social psychological theory concerned with how communities and citizens can more democratically work through and address the legacies of social traumas of misrecognition, focusing specifically on traumas associated with race. And I argue that Kleinian concepts can be used to illuminate these broader political processes and possibilities. In essence, I'm using Klein to theorize not only what some have called the moral psychology of whiteness, but also a moral psychology of anti-racist democracy. And I do this through developing a theory of mourning as an ongoing social and personal developmental challenge. So for Klein, and this is why I turned to her, mourning is not primarily or merely the terminable process of accepting the loss of our attachments. Mourning instead is the interminable process of mitigating affective cognitive dogmatism, which perverts our relationships to others and to ourselves. And this understanding grows out of Klein's concepts of the positions. For Klein, individuals experience reality from different cognitive affective schemas, which she labels the paranoid schizoid position and the depressive position. Now, I'm not going to go too far into the weeds on Klein here, but there are a few ideas worth emphasizing. For Klein, the paranoid schizoid position originates at birth when the ego is relatively unintegrated and incapable of distinguishing sharply between inner and external worlds. The early ego splits the world between the comforting good breast and the persecutory bad breast, which serves as a receptacle for the negative affects associated with stress and deprivation. The early ego deploys this splitting defense along with corollary defenses of idealization and demonization, good and bad, as a hedge against an intolerable reality. These part objects are then hermetically sealed from each other, and from within this space, the other either merges with and protects the fragile ego in its role as the good breast, or it threatens the self with disintegration or annihilation, i.e. the bad breast. Within the depressive position, on the other hand, the ego develops a capacity to integrate the polarized aspects of its internal and external world, holding contrasts in common, right, or at the same time. The depressive position is first heralded by the development of object permanency, which marks a watershed in development insofar as it permits the discovery that the good and bad objects are merely parts of the same object, i.e. the caregiver. The depressive position, therefore, marks the first appearance of loss. You can't actually experience loss in the paranoid schizoid position, Klein implies. But this loss is not the death of the loved object, but the death of the early part objects as pure sources of love or hatred. Recognizing the whole other as a complete object, then, requires what she calls a psychical weaning from the compromises and defenses of the paranoid schizoid position and its Manichaean world of absolute good and evil. Now, with loss, then, dawns a capacity to mourn, which for Klein means acknowledging and accepting the imperfections and ambivalence of self and other. Through this labor, we liberate feelings of guilt and a capacity for reparation. Reparation, in effect, is the gift of mourning. For Klein, reparation is born within the depressive position by the recognition of the wholeness of both self and other, and the corollary recognition of the harm done through the splitting of experience. Nurtured by the labor of mourning, reparation is not a simple empathy for others, so much as the recognition that we have damaged the other and ourselves by maintaining a construct of them as objects either of pure loathing or perfect love. The reparative impulse is essential for building relationships outside these fantasies of blissful merger or pure antagonism. Within the depressive position, the individual has to lose and mourn the image of an ideal or a pure object. As a result, conflicts can be made conscious for the first time. As the ego increases its ability to live with the competing and conflicted demands of its objects and its passions, it cultivates a deeper capacity for tolerance and generosity. The depressive position in this respect marks a mitigation of cognitive and affective dogmatism and the overcoming of defenses by which the ego keeps the ambivalence of self and other out of its conscious awareness. Now, again, in the book, I try to think about how Klein's account of mourning developed within the interpersonal dynamics of the analyst-analysand relationship can help us to think about the possibilities and pathologies of social or public mourning, and how this vocabulary might illuminate the challenges of democracy or citizenship differently. And I turn to a variety of other interlocutors to do this. For now, let me reference my reading of James Baldwin here, because I think Baldwin is kind of a Kleinian, even though he didn't use the language. So for Baldwin, I argue, Americans' racial history has positioned them into a kind of paranoid schizoid functioning in which the terror of their collective historical inheritance has to be split off or denied. And again, although Baldwin himself did not use the discourse of psychoanalysis, I argue that Baldwin interpreted American identity in terms of paranoid schizoid defenses. As he puts it, it is comparatively easy to invest a population with false morale by giving them a false sense of superiority. And this sense of superiority is predicated upon and held in place by racial inferiors who serve as a receptacle for terror that cannot be acknowledged. As he puts it in a separate interview, he says, Americans are terrified. They know that they are capable of genocide. History is built on genocide, but they can't face it. And it doesn't make any difference what Americans think they can think. They are terrified. So whiteness, then, for Baldwin, is what I would call a paranoid schizoid state of mind. It is rooted in a terror that cannot be expressed because to do so would cause the disintegration of the boundaries that reinforce identity. The security of racial identity, as it were, is a twinned fantasy of the good breast and bad breast, which combine to offer the reassurance of a social floor below which one cannot fall. The good breast, the psychological wages of whiteness, is a fantasy, but it's a fantasy with material and obviously electoral effects. Nevertheless, for Baldwin as for Klein, the paranoid schizoid position is in isolation a self-destructive form of existence. And now, thanks to Alexander, I need to engage King's reading of Freud in order to think that as well. As Baldwin puts it, nothing worse happens to a man or a woman, a person or a people than to deny, to make a fantasy out of one of the central facts of their lives. That man, that woman, that person, that people atrophies. Racial categories or states of mind, in fact, ensure that the entanglements and blood ties of American history will be denied. Social practices of separation reinforce these categories and prolong the recognition of entanglement. All of this, however, comes with a terrible price, right? As Baldwin puts it, you can't deny your brothers without paying a cost for it, without paying a terrible price for it, right? So then what would a moral psychology of democratic integration look like, and how and where might it show up? As Baldwin famously argued in The Fire Next Time, integration, and again, now I'm reading this through King, right? Integration means, if it means anything, that we with love shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality, and to begin to change it. And my question is whether Klein's concept of the positions and the work of Mourning help us to think about the politics of democratic integration. For Klein, the crux of the depressive position is the acknowledgement of the ambivalence of self and other. Initially, the depressive position involves the dawning awareness of the whole object. Using Baldwin, we can see how this might have a social or political analog. Because for Baldwin, despite its horrors, the American past is not a one-sided catastrophe, but an ambivalent whole object containing what he calls both love and murder. As Baldwin puts it, we have had to go through many dangerous toils and snags. Our fathers had to go through death, slaughter, and murder, things we still see around us. But there is more than that behind us. If not, we wouldn't be able to walk a single day or draw a single breath. So for Baldwin, the challenge is to let neither the necessary remembrance of the toils and snags obscure the resiliency and agency of the more than that, nor to let stories of survival serve as a means of denying the ongoing catastrophes of violence. The struggle, rather, as Baldwin puts it in Notes of a Native Son, is both to accept totally without rancor life as it is and men as they are, while also refusing to accept injustice as commonplace and to, quote, fight them with all one's strength. But what kind of fight, and who will we wage it? Who will wage it, and how? And this is a question, as I see it, that's been floating in and out of most of the panels during this conference. So according to Eve Sedgwick, Klein's positions offer distinct pictures of what political agency could look like. Within the paranoid schizoid position, agency is all or nothing, since it is colored by fantasies and anxieties of omnipotence and splitting. Agency is all or nothing because the self and its others can only be experienced as powerless or omnipotent, right? By contrast, the depressive position is built on the awareness of multiple powers, presences, and possibilities. We might call this a mournful vision of agency, which accepts the difficult co-presence of ambivalence within self and other. For Sedgwick, then, the depressive position gives off an image of power as, quote, a form of relationality that deals in, for example, negotiations, including win-win negotiations, the exchange of affect and other small differentials, the middle ranges of agency, the notion that you can be relatively empowered or disempowered without annihilating someone else or being annihilated. Now, the agency of the depressive position is never fully secured, but is, for Sedgwick, a fragile achievement that requires discovering over and over. Klein's positional account of life, because she thinks you never achieve escape velocity from the paranoid schizoid position, it's more of an oscillation throughout your life. Klein's positional account of life makes integration a precarious achievement more than a stable outcome. Integration and depressive agency are always susceptible to rupture or failure. The paranoid schizoid position is a cognitive affective state to which we habitually return throughout life as strains and stresses provoke its characteristic defenses and collapse the space of mediation within the self and between self and other. So mourning then is less a temporary response to loss than it is a way of living in the world, with an affective leaning towards reciprocity and generosity alongside a tragic awareness of failure and loss. How much time do I have now?
You have like 3 minutes.
Oh, well, that's not good at all. So that's old stuff. That's old stuff. So for the rest of my talk, which is like now 2 minutes long, I want to reflect on the question of who is called or left behind in the articulation of democracy, mourning, and work within what I call the democratic work of mourning. So does this framework, indebted to psychoanalysis, inherently and problematically privilege certain forms of life or modes of engagement? And even worse, do these assumptions rest upon a racialized distinction or an implicit racial ontology? And to ask these questions, I try to engage with the claims of Afro-pessimism. Now, I've got a few pages on Afro-pessimism, but let me scroll down to my summary of them. Because as I reconstruct Afro-pessimism, I see it in 3 clusters of claims that are radically incommensurable with the assumptions that I'm working with in the book Mourning in America. So the first claim, or the cluster of claims, 3 in total, anti-blackness and racism are not contingent phenomena, but reflect a basic partitioning of social being, which is rooted in the history of enslavement and which persists through slavery's afterlife. 2, ontological anti-blackness puts a structural limit on the value of participating in or engaging with existing hegemonic institutions, discourses, or practices, since those institutions only recognize certain registers of voice while excluding blackness as such. 3, the structural limit on resistance within existing orders calls for an unimaginable cleansing violence, this is mostly Frank Wilderson here, that would completely reset social life. In the meantime, we can only trace and aesthetically depict the persistence of anti-black violence, remaining awake, vigilant, waiting, and presumably plotting. Now, all of these claims seem fundamentally incommensurable with the democratic project of mourning that, 1, sees the legacies of slavery and colonization as unjust forms of social violence and injury with ongoing yet complex and differentiated impacts in contemporary societies. 2, sees existing practices and institutions as intertwined with legacies of stigma and violence, yet also sees within those spaces room for maneuver, agency, and redress. And 3, draws on an account of mourning offered by the Western discourse of object relations psychoanalysis in order to develop a moral psychology appropriate for practices of democratic citizenship that favor the awareness of ambivalence within our political traditions, spaces, and practices as a means of taking up those practices and engaging those spaces. So what is to be done then, right, with this incommensurability here? It is far too tempting, I say, to map Afro-pessimism using Klein's concepts of the positions, to see pessimism as resting upon paranoid schizoid assumptions about social life and social death. The imaginary of Afro-pessimism seems indebted to both a notion of the bad breast of deathless white supremacy and an idealized good breast of righteous violence. Agency is all or nothing, completely zero-sum. Moreover, there is a complete denial of reparation or mediation born from the depressive position. Skip down here. The problem with this approach to diagnosing Afro-pessimism, as it were, is it slides too easily into what Fred Moten has called the stance of the pathologist. It deploys the authority of the white analyst to discipline and punish a resistant analysand and to interpret those resistances towards mediation, commensuration, and participation as symptoms of an illness. Such a reading is especially problematic, and this is, I'm getting to the part of the paper which is most important for me, especially problematic because it has to be admitted that Klein's account of reparation and guilt seems to itself rest on a racial and colonial partition. Although Klein, for the most part, was reluctant to explore her theoretical concepts on the terrain of the social, there's one notable exception in her essay Love, Guilt, and Reparation in 1937. So this is Melanie Klein here. She says, in his pursuit of the explorer gives expression to both aggression and the drive for reparation. We know that in discovering a new country, aggression is shown more openly. Especially was this so in former times when ruthless cruelty against native populations was displayed by people who had not only explored, but conquered and colonized. Some of the early fantasized attacks against the imaginary babies in the mother's body and actual hatred against newborn brothers and sisters were here expressed in reality by the attitude towards the natives. The wished-for restoration, however, found full expression in repopulating the country with people of their own nationality. So, is Klein an Afro-pessimist? In this passage, Klein both theorizes and affirms a racial partition created by colonization, and she restricts the work of reparation to the settler side of the equation. The ruthless cruelty of colonization and enslavement can be made whole, the wished-for restoration, through reparative acts within settler communities. Gratuitous violence inspires unconscious and conscious guilt that thankfully can be unloaded through the continued operation of settler colonialism. And moreover, Klein resigns the violence of colonialism and enslavement to the past, quote-unquote, former times, in 1937, at a time when British colonialism was still in an active phase and when African Americans were still being subjected to the white vigilante justice of lynching and the segregation of Jim Crow. So history then is constructed as a mechanism of forgetting continued violence, and the violence itself does not trouble the normative order of settler communities. In fact, it reinforces that order. Now, one more paragraph. So in this respect, Klein's account of guilt and reparation, or of mourning, can be said to rest upon a racialized partition of reality and history. And I don't wrestle with this adequately in the book, which is, I'm arguing now, highly problematic. Because this passage makes it clear to me that accounts of public mourning, especially those resting on this particular archive, face an unpalatable possibility that they repeat traumas of racialization rather than offering means of articulation, mediation, and repair for those traumas. So what is needed then is a deracialization of mourning akin to the deracialization of liberalism called for by Charles Mills. Now, both of these moves rest upon a non-ideal form of theorizing that acknowledges the full impact of white supremacy, not only in its concrete historical operations or its social psychological manifestations, but also within the intellectual and theoretical repertoire used by political theorists. Otherwise, we risk a lack of attunement to the ways in which our categories and concepts may reflect social divisions while surreptitiously deploying the unspoken terms of that division in order to reject forms of resistance. Doing so would mute the expressions of black pain articulated by Afro-pessimists and others, while perversely claiming that it is doing everything possible to clear space for those expressions. If the democratic work of mourning is to do much work for democracy, then it has to be more receptive to resistance while also persistently calling for and cultivating spaces of mediation and collaboration. This would combine an anti-racist hermeneutics of suspicion with, as George Shulman has argued, an activist struggle of life against death. Mourning as a hinge between death and life can call us to this doubled task, as long as we see it as a project that is ultimately ongoing and most likely endless. Thank you.
So, unlike everyone else who has thanked me, I have to blame myself, because when we were planning this, somehow it seemed that, it was unfortunate that if you're the organizer of a conference, you don't get the benefit of presenting your work and getting feedback, except that now that I'm in this position, I realize why people don't do the two things. So I have only myself to blame. So this paper is an attempt to begin to think through the questions of the relationship between grief and Black politics, and to ask actually specifically questions about the ways in which Black politics has actually narrowed the space for grief. And so I will begin. The death of activist Erica Garner in 2017 at 27 from a heart attack provoked profound sadness, deep despair, and rage among Black women. Garner was propelled into activism following the death of her father, Eric, after he was placed in a fatal chokehold by a New York City police officer. The viral video of Eric Garner's fatal interaction with agents of the state, which was prompted, as so many other police killings of unarmed Black persons have been, by a seemingly innocuous act, in his case selling unlicensed cigarettes, made "I can't breathe" one of the defining catchphrases of the Black Lives Matter protests against police violence. Eric Garner's death scene and Michael Brown's unattended black body lying in the street for hours became emblematic images of racial violence in the US in the 21st century. In turn, Erica Garner's death, less than 4 years after her father was killed, poses stark questions about the intergenerational costs of state violence, the burdens of activism, and the enhanced and unrecognized vulnerabilities faced by Black women. Garner's tragic premature death, the fact that her heart literally stopped beating, also points to the urgent need to examine what it would mean to grapple fully with Black loss without subsuming it to the imperatives of democratic repair. Garner's death at such a young age raises questions about the personal and physical toll of the kind of Black activism against racial injustice that is usually lauded as an exemplary democratic act. And here we have to think about how even those of us who saw Garner as a hero, Erica Garner, nevertheless also failed to see her as hurting and vulnerable. And this reminds me, as we think about Erica Garner, about this other famous Garner, right, Margaret Garner, whose story inspired Morrison's Beloved, and whom Frederick Douglass also argued we should view as a hero in a moment that seemed unable to recognize the unspeakable losses that made her a hero in his mind. So while she is certainly grievable because of the polity's need to embrace her as a heroic warrior for social justice who was able to use her personal pain to further collective political aims, we may have nevertheless tended to forget that she was above all grieving. If white supremacy materialized in police violence literally makes it impossible for Black citizens to breathe, Erica Garner's death raises the uncomfortable possibility that attempts to transform white supremacy also exact an unacceptable toll on Black activists, especially Black women. For Black politics writ large, this raises a number of questions. What are the effects of grounding projects of racial justice on a conception of public mourning of Black death that foregrounds questions of democratic repair? What role can and should grief play in Black politics? In the Trump era, when claims of white grievance are pervasive, is Black grief, as opposed to Black death, even legible? These urgent questions for Black politics are arising at a time when political theorists have been paying increasing attention to questions of public grief, as we saw David mention, and have argued that we should view mourning as a resource for democratic politics. And in this paper, what I'm trying to do is to trace how African American thinkers in particular have approached the politics of mourning and grief. I focus in particular on the way in which private grief turned public mourning has been a central feature of Black politics, and argue that paradoxically, the hypervisibility of Black death and the imperative to channel grief into activism that has been the dominant approach to loss in African American political thought has functioned to make Black grief illegible in certain ways. So I turn to a brief discussion of this historical relationship between grief and Black politics. And here, think of the iconic photograph of Mamie Till Mobley overcome with grief at the open casket holding her son Emmett's disfigured body, which is emblematic of the key role that private grief transformed into catalytic public mourning has historically played in Black politics. And many people have turned to this moment and to Till on her decision as, including Elizabeth Alexander, who argues that a whole generation of Black writers cite this moment of seeing the photographs of Till's body as important in their own development and their own lives. And here I also see this in relationship to Shatima Treadcraft's new work on what she calls the spectacular death deficit, and how we need to think about how Black politics has been galvanized by certain forms of spectacular death. So I would argue that in addition to violence and death, a particular limited conception of Black grief has also been central to Black politics. And Elizabeth Alexander, begins to get at this when she observes that Blacks individually and as a group have had to be both participant and witness to the violence against them. She argues that, quote, in order to survive, Black people have paradoxically had to witness their own murder and defilement, and then pass along the epic tale of violation, end quote. So what does it mean to not only suffer violence, but also to have to be responsible for passing along the tale of that violence, as Till Mobley did, in order to try to obtain an elusive justice for one's dead? So I think that because of this, this pattern, let's say, that Alexander points to, right, of having to be both participant and witness, what we get is these constricted parameters that regulate the expression of Black grief, right? So on the one hand, in order to gain, sympathy for your dead, you're also, and this I'm reminded of the moment that Yasmin pointed out, in fact, that moment when Sabrina Fulton, when it's actually the stepfather, I think, who says, let's burn this down, I mean, that's an expression of Black anger that's not seen as the kind of thing you do, right, to get sympathy for your dead. Instead, you have to be somehow stoic and not seen as a danger, and your grief can't be seen as excessive. And so I argue that this certain form of Black grief galvanized into public mourning has been a central template of Black activism, from Till Mobley to Fulton and Martin to Garner, but it also comes with a prescribed script, and it exacts a steep price. And this ubiquity of grief is noted by Claudia Rankine when she argues that, quote, the condition of Black life is one of mourning. For Rankine, mourning is central to Black life because the personal and collective cost of living with constant vulnerability makes loss a constant fear and inevitable experience. But I think the problem goes beyond the toll that turning private grief into public mourning exacts on the families of victims. It has to do with the very conception of Black politics that situates Black grief as an antidote to the ills of the body politic. And what I want to argue in particular, right, is that there are certain forms of Black grief that don't fit this script, that in some ways are even more illegible than these other emotions that are seen as excessive. So in some ways, I argue it's even more illegible than Black anger. So the argument then is somewhat counterintuitive in that it's that on the one hand, we have this hypervisibility of Black death and the imperative to channel grief into activism, that has paradoxically functioned to make certain forms of Black grief illegible, right? Because it circumscribes the space actually for grief. So what I'm interested in is thinking about non-instrumental accounts of Black grief, those that don't foreground either the move to national public mourning in order to mobilize for racial redress or the imperatives of democratic repair. And I argue that we see these present actually in African American political thought, but they remain a minor key. And we see this, and there's a really poignant example of this in actually a sonic example of this illegibility and this inability to sit with certain forms of grief in the film 12 Years a Slave. And of course, the film has been criticized in some ways for the very, right, the beating of Patsy as this moment of reenacting, right, this black pain and black and anti-black violence. But actually, there is this other moment, which for me is not a moment of violence, but is even more difficult in some ways to sit with. And it's the harrowing scene in which Eliza audibly mourns for the loss of her children, and Solomon can't bear to witness her pain. And I'm going to read you a bit from the script here. And Solomon says, "Eliza, Eliza, stop. Eliza, it's all I have to keep my losses present." And if you remember, she's literally wailing, right? And he can't bear it, and so he stops her. And he says, you let yourself be overcome by sorrow. You will drown in it. And she replies, "Have you stopped crying for your children? You make no sounds, but will you ever let them go in your heart?" And he replies, "They are as my flesh." And then she says, "Then who is distressed? Do I upset the mistress and the master? Do you care less for my loss than their well-being? Oh, Solomon, let me weep for my children." So Eliza's insistence on mourning her losses, even when it's unproductive, right? So Solomon's objection is that she's not going to get them back, exemplifies this other approach to grief that I want to highlight. Solomon's decision to deal with his grief by bottling it up in order not to fall into despair, in order to survive and one day regain his freedom, I think, represents a dominant approach to grief in the tradition. So I trace these two approaches in the rest of the paper by looking at the work of Ida B. Wells and Harriet Jacobs. And one of the things that I want to point out is I'm not saying that, we should switch one for the other, but what I'm saying is that one has been dominant and we need to make more space for the second approach. And Wells is an interesting figure because, she's of course known as for her anti-lynching activism and for the enormous amount of work that she does to keep, right, the bodies of lynched black men and women in the eyes of the body politic at the time. But what's interesting is that in Wells's anti-lynching activism, it's often, I think, or the dominant mode is this sort of quick turn from grief into activism. But there are some moments when you see something else, and I'm going to talk here about those moments. How much time do I have?
You have 8 minutes.
Okay.
10.
So what I would say is that when we think about Wells's approach to black loss as they emerge in her anti-lynching writings and her writings about white race riots and massacres, one element is the focus on black death and on the violation of the black body. A second element is a focus on white violence and white rage. A third is actually this the way in which grief and black life emerge only in flashes in certain ways. And fourth is this kind of sociological approach to anti-racist activism that relies on data and statistics in order to make the case to a wider public. So I want to focus on this third and to a lesser extent on the fourth point. Now, one of the things that we need to think about in thinking about Wells, right, is that she is also a black woman who's in the public sphere at a time when there were constraints, obviously, on the ability of women and black people to occupy these spaces. And so there's a way in which, her feminist readers of Wells have argued that we must read her self-presentation in terms of these sexist gender norms and racist norms that constrain how she can present herself in public. But in one of her first anti-lynching lectures after the death of her friend Thomas Moss, and this is in her first public lecture on lynching in New York City in 1892, following her exile from Memphis. We see one of those moments in which Black grief is really present in Wells's text. And she makes the speech to an audience of middle-class Black women at Lyric Hall, and in it, Wells, the newspaper accounts reveal, becomes mortified and at the fact that she displays emotion, which she later says she viewed basically as a weakness. But the moment when Wells becomes overcome is when she's telling the story of Thomas Moss's family. In that lecture, Wells recalls the grief of Tom Moss's wife, Betty, who shed tears that fell thick and fast at the sad fate of her husband while rocking their infant son and their baby daughter, who would toddle to kiss her father's letter carrier uniform and raise her little hands in the air, asking to be picked up in a gesture that would never again be reciprocated. Wells's account of the Moss's family's grief is so affecting precisely because of the abundance of quotidian details of Black life. His letter carrier's uniform, a mother rocking her sleeping child, the toddler with outstretched arms. And in contrast, I would say, in Wells's subsequent anti-lynching writings, the focus shifts more squarely onto white rage and brutality, or the tortured Black body, than on these quotidian details about Black life. And the communities that often appear in these narratives are actually composed of white mobs reveling in horrific anti-Black violence rather than Black families and communities. So the Black dead most often appear as individuals surrounded by angry white mobs. But in this inaugural anti-lynching lecture, what we see is Wells giving voice to Black families mourning their losses in a way that is not quite as present in the rest of her writings. And a rare exception to this is one of her last published works, actually, The Arkansas Race Riot, which is a pamphlet chronicling a massacre in 1919 in which white mobs killed hundreds of Black sharecroppers who were attempting to unionize. And here, Wells, and here there's a question about Wells's sources, right? She often relied on the accounts in white newspapers, but in the case of the Arkansas Race Riot, she's able to gather firsthand information about the massacre by passing as a relative and joining the wives and mothers visiting the prisoners being held in a state prison. In this 1920 text, she writes directly about the grief of the prisoners, and she tells the story of this song that they wrote about their experience called I Stand and Wring My Hands and Cry, which she says they sang in heartbreaking tones. And Wells tells her readers that the prisoners sang this modern sorrow song in the most mournful tones ever heard, and that she advised them to hold on to their religious faith in order not to give in to despair. But then the rest of the pamphlet goes on to, give all the facts of the case in Wells's usual style. So we see both of these strategies, I would argue, present in this text. And I want to turn, in the few minutes I imagine I have left, probably optimistically, to say something briefly about Harriet Jacobs, because I think Jacobs in Incidents actually, in a text that I think has often been seen or was certainly not taken seriously for a long time because it was seen as part of the genre of sentimental fiction, that in fact Jacobs in this text, in a bracing and very direct way, confronts loss and sorrow without descending into pathos. And we see this in some moments in which, as Jasmine beautifully pointed out today, where earlier today, where Jacobs mourns various kinds of losses. But the ones that I point to in my piece have to do with these moments, a couple of moments. One is the death of Aunt Nancy, and I argue that in this we see, and what happens is Aunt Nancy, right, was Jacobs's aunt. She spends her whole life taking care of this white family. She finally dies, and Jacobs's mother and grandmother and her uncle Philip use the money from their wages to give her the kind of burial that they want. And Jacobs tells the story, and she says, if a northern person seeing this would have thought that this was some sign of the benevolence of the slaveholder. But she says, we could have told them a different story. We could have given them a chapter of wrongs and sufferings that would have touched their hearts if they had any hearts to feel for the colored people. And so she basically goes on to say, right, that there is this whole other set of stories about, right, Black life and Black death that remain untold. And so I think that in this approach, what we see in Incidents is an approach to Black loss that makes space for Black grief, even as it also insists on centering Black life. And I can talk a little bit more about that because I think I'm running out of time. So I'm going to move to the conclusion. And I think what this essay is really about is about how the stories we tell about Black grief shape Black politics. And the predominant story we have told is that it is easily channeled into activism and instrumentalized in the service of projects of public multiracial mourning that can perform the work of racial redress and democratic repair. But to paraphrase Toni Morrison's response to the question of how will we know when Black lives really matter, she said, quote, I want to see a cop shoot a white unarmed teenager in the back. I want to see a white man convicted for raping a Black woman. Then when you ask me, is it over? I will say yes, end quote. So to paraphrase Morrison, we will have allowed Black folk to be fully human when Black grief no longer has to be mobilized in service of repairing white democracy. Thank you.